Welcome to another episode of Serial Killer Files by Skoob. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're diving into one of the most chilling cases from the early 1900s. A story that introduced the world to a terrifying new kind of killer. This is the story of John Frank Hickey, better known as the Postcard Killer. Picture this. It's 1911, and police officers across New York are dealing with missing children, unsolved murders, and then something unprecedented happens. A postcard arrives at the police station. Not just any postcard, but one that would change how we understand serial killers forever. The sender, a man who would taunt law enforcement, terrorize communities, and leave behind a trail of victims that spanned decades. Today, we'll explore the twisted mind of John Frank Hickey, from his brutal childhood to his shocking crimes, and ultimately, to the postcards that would become his signature and his downfall. Let me take you back to October 29th, 1865, in Lowell, Massachusetts. A child was born to Irish immigrant parents, John Frank Hickey. From the very beginning, this was not a story destined for happiness. The Hickey household was a place where violence and cruelty were everyday realities. After his eventual arrest, Hickey himself would reveal the darkness of his childhood. His father, he claimed, had been physically cruel to him throughout his young years. We can only imagine what form this cruelty took. But whatever happened in that Massachusetts home, it planted the seeds of something monstrous. Growing up in an industrial town like Lowell meant hard times for most families, but for young John Frank, it meant something far worse. The combination of poverty, immigrant struggles, and domestic violence created a perfect storm of psychological damage. While we can't definitively say what transforms a child into a killer, Hickey's early years certainly provided no shortage of trauma. What's particularly chilling is how this background would later manifest. Unlike killers driven by sudden rage or passion, Hickey would develop into something far more calculating and cold. His childhood experiences didn't just make him violent. They made him manipulative, cunning, and eerily detached from human suffering. The question that haunts criminologists even today is, could anything have been done to prevent what John Frank Hickey would become? In the 1870s and 1880s, there were no social services, no child protection agencies, and certainly no understanding of how childhood trauma could create adult monsters. Young Hickey was essentially left to develop his twisted worldview in isolation, with no intervention and no hope of redemption. September 1st, 1883. John Frank Hickey was just 18 years old when he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Most young men his age in Lowell were focused on keeping their jobs in the mills, helping their families survive, or simply making it through another grueling day of industrial labor. But Hickey's mind was already operating on a different frequency entirely. His victim was Edwin W. Morey, a co-worker at their shared workplace. Here's what makes this first murder so incredibly disturbing. There was no dramatic confrontation, no heated argument, no crime of passion. Instead, Hickey's motive was chillingly practical. He believed Morey was a threat to his job security. In Hickey's twisted logic, if Morey caused problems or made mistakes, both of them could lose their employment. Rather than address the situation like a normal person, by talking to Morey, finding a new job, or simply accepting the risk, Hickey chose murder. His weapon of choice reveals just how calculating he was, even at 18. Laudanum, a mixture of alcohol and opium that was readily available as medicine in the 1880s. It was used for pain relief, coughs, and sleep problems, making it the perfect poison because overdoses were common and rarely investigated as suspicious deaths. Hickey knew exactly what he was doing. He understood that laudanum poisoning could appear to be a sudden illness or accidental overdose. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was carefully planned and executed by someone who, despite his youth, already possessed a killer's mentality. But here's where the story gets even more chilling. After Maury died from the laudanum poisoning, Hickey didn't panic or flee. Instead, he went directly to the police and reported that he had discovered Maury's body. He played the role of a concerned coworker who had stumbled upon something tragic. One police officer later remarked that Hickey seemed too composed for a man who had just discovered a dead coworker. That instinct was correct, but at the time, it wasn't enough evidence to act on. Hickey's ability to remain calm and helpful after committing murder would become a defining characteristic of his criminal career. When the truth finally came out and Hickey was arrested, his confession was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. He showed no remorse, no emotional breakdown, no recognition of the horror of what he'd done. Instead, he explained the murder in purely practical terms. He killed Maury to protect their jobs. One report described him as speaking without visible emotion, as if explaining a poor decision rather than a killing. Hickey was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison. Many people probably thought that justice had been served, that a young man who'd made a terrible mistake would serve his time and hopefully reform. They had no idea that this was just the beginning. By 1887, John Frank Hickey had been released from prison and was attempting to rebuild his life. At least that's what it looked like on the surface. He secured a position as assistant secretary at the YMCA in Lowell, Massachusetts, a respected organization focused on moral guidance and community service. This wasn't just any job. The YMCA gave Hickey access to a larger social network, respectability, and most importantly, trust. People saw him as capable, polite, and well-spoken. He seemed to be the perfect example of a reformed young man who had learned from his mistakes. But this was all an elaborate facade. Hickey was developing skills that would serve him well in his criminal career. The ability to appear normal, trustworthy, and even admirable while hiding his true nature. He could charm people, gain their confidence, and present himself as a model citizen. In 1895, seeking to further cement his respectable image, Hickey joined a Masonic lodge. Freemasonry was associated with honor, community influence, and moral character. For someone with Hickey's background, acceptance into such an organization was a significant social achievement. But maintaining this double life required constant vigilance, and Hickey couldn't sustain it indefinitely. That same year, he was arrested for stealing alcohol. While this might seem like a minor crime, for a Mason it represented a serious breach of trust and moral conduct. The lodge expelled him immediately. This expulsion was more than just embarrassing. It was a public declaration that Hickey's character was fundamentally flawed. According to one contemporary account, he reacted with bitter anger, telling a friend, "They think they can judge me, but they don't know what I have done or what I can do." That statement is absolutely chilling when you consider what we know about his past and future crimes. It reveals that even in the 1890s, Hickey saw himself as operating above normal moral and social boundaries. He believed he was beyond judgment, beyond the rules that governed ordinary people. After his expulsion from the Masonic Lodge, Hickey's life took a dramatic turn. By 1896, he left Lowell entirely and began what would become a pattern for the rest of his criminal career. Constant movement, drifting through Canada and the northeastern United States, taking various jobs, but never staying anywhere long enough to face consequences or scrutiny. This transient lifestyle was perfect for someone like Hickey. It allowed him to reinvent himself repeatedly, escape suspicion, and avoid the kind of close relationships that might expose his true nature. He could be whoever he needed to be in each new town, each new job, each new situation. A police report from 1901 looking back at this period, noted that even in his 20s, Hickey understood the advantage of blending into respectable society while quietly bending rules to his benefit. He was learning to be a predator who could hide in plain sight. October 12, 1911, Lackawanna, New York. John Frank Hickey was now 45 years old, and his decades of drifting and petty crimes were about to escalate into something truly horrific. On this autumn day, he would commit the murder that would finally expose him to the world and earn him lasting infamy. His victim was 7-year-old Joey Joseph, a child who was simply playing near his neighborhood when his life intersected with pure evil. Joey was the kind of innocent victim that serial killers often target, vulnerable, trusting, and easily isolated from safety. Witnesses later recalled seeing Joey earlier that day, walking and playing as children do in working-class communities. There was no sign of immediate danger, no obvious threat. Hickey used the same tactics he had perfected over the years, appearing harmless, trustworthy, even kind. Investigators believed he engaged Joey in conversation, perhaps offering help or presence, using false kindness to gain the child's trust. Once Hickey had Joey isolated and away from potential help, he committed acts that were so brutal I won't detail them fully in this podcast. What I will say is that Hickey sexually assaulted the child before strangling him to death. The murder was not quick or merciful. It was the work of someone who had completely abandoned any connection to human decency. After killing Joey, Hickey hid the body in an outdoor toilet behind a saloon, a place few people would think to look, tucked away and out of sight. For a time, Joey's disappearance remained a mystery. His family searched desperately, neighbors joined in, and the entire community was gripped by that particular kind of terror that comes when a child simply vanishes. Hours passed, then days. Parents called their children indoors. The streets that had once been filled with playing kids became empty and watchful. Everyone feared the worst, but hoped against hope for a miracle that would never come. And then, something happened that shocked even seasoned police officers who thought they'd seen everything. A postcard arrived at the police station addressed to the local police chief. The message was written in a calm, almost casual tone, as if the sender were giving directions to a friend. But this wasn't a friendly note. This was a killer announcing his crime, providing specific details that only the murderer could know, and taunting the very people trying to solve the case. The era of the Postcard Killer had officially begun. On October 30th, 1911, Police Chief Gilson of Lackawanna received a postcard that would change everything. The message was chilling in its specificity and casual tone. Joseph will be found in the bottom of a water closet with 3 seats, back of the saloon near Doyle's on Ridge Road. A drunk, crazed brain done the deed, and remorse and sorrow for the parents is bringing results that will soon come to an end. The demon whiskey will then have one more victim, making 4 in all. Drag the closet with the 3 seats. At first, police weren't sure if this was a cruel hoax or legitimate information, but the details were too precise to ignore. Officers went to the exact location described, an outhouse with 3 seats behind a saloon on Ridge Road, and found Joey's body exactly where the postcard had indicated. This first postcard revealed 2 crucial things about the sender. First, he knew intimate details about the crime that only the killer could know. Second, and perhaps more disturbing, he was actively taunting investigators with a mixture of confession and twisted justification. The phrase, "a drunk, crazed brain done the deed," and the reference to the demon whiskey showed Hickey attempting to shift blame to alcohol and fate. The line about remorse and sorrow for the parents that would soon come to an end read like a threat wrapped in false sympathy. But Hickey didn't stop with just one postcard. Over the following weeks and months, he launched what can only be described as a campaign of psychological terrorism through the mail. He sent multiple postcards and letters to police, to newspapers, and most cruelly, to Joey's grieving father, George Joseph. Some messages repeated the location information in slightly different wording. Others went much further, providing graphic details about the sexual abuse Joey had suffered before his death. In one particularly disturbing postcard to Joey's father, Hickey wrote about details of the crime while claiming he hoped the letters might help bring closure. 3 separate pieces of correspondence were mailed from Boston to George Joseph on the same day in November 1912. These included 2 postcards dated November 9, 1912, and another card that described the sexual assault and murder in horrific detail. The psychological torture Hickey was inflicting on the grieving family is almost impossible to comprehend. These later postcards were particularly disturbing because they mixed casual detail with attempts to justify the murder. Hickey would describe Joey's final moments, then claim he couldn't bear the family's suffering and that his messages were meant to help the Joseph family deal with their grief. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but the postcards revealed even more crimes. In one message, Hickey wrote, "Wednesday night, December 10th, 1902, I enticed Michael Crook, a newsboy at 86th Street in Central Park West, New York City, into the park opposite the entrance to the Arsenal police station, and I abused him and later strangled him and just escaped the police officer who found him." Another postcard claimed, "3 times I have taken life." Yet another declared, "I am also the murderer of 12 more kids." If these claims were true, police weren't just dealing with one horrific murder, they were potentially chasing one of America's most prolific serial killers. The postcards also contained references that suggested education and social standing. Hickey mentioned being a 32nd degree Freemason and included Latin phrases in his writing. One postcard referenced Banquo's ghost from Shakespeare's Macbeth, the character who haunts Macbeth, representing his guilty conscience. Perhaps most chilling were the postcards that showed no remorse whatsoever. One threatened future violence. "My brain is worse, and all I think of is murder, and I love to kill. Or shall kill some kid before I leave here Sunday." Another described Joey's final moments with disturbing detachment. "He is the first kid I killed that never fought. He just laid down and died." The postcards that Hickey intended as taunts and displays of power ultimately became the evidence that destroyed him. While he was busy terrorizing families and mocking police through the mail, investigators were working methodically to identify their tormentor. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 2 days after the Buffalo News published reproductions of the postcards on their front page, asking the public for help identifying the handwriting, a man named John Hoskin contacted Superintendent Reagan. Hoskin recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to someone he had worked with at Buffalo's chemical works plant. Hoskin was the chief millwright, and back in September 1911, he had hired the postcard writer. The man's name was J. Frank Hickey. Hoskin described Hickey as a man in his mid-40s who wore glasses and seemed both quiet and overqualified for the position. Despite finding him somewhat unusual, Hoskin had hired him anyway. 4 days later, Hickey quit, eventually finding work at another factory in Buffalo, but he had promised to write to Hoskin. 4 months later, Hoskin received a letter from Hickey. He still had that letter when he saw the postcards on the front page of the Buffalo News, and the handwriting was unmistakably the same. Hoskin brought the letter to Superintendent Reagan, who consulted with Chief Gilson and submitted both the letter and the postcards to a handwriting expert. The analysis was definitive. They were a perfect match. Armed with a name and confirmed handwriting evidence, police began building a comprehensive profile of J. Frank Hickey. Like his victim, Joey Joseph, Hickey was the son of immigrants. His parents had come from Ireland and settled in Massachusetts. As an adult, Hickey had meandered around the Northeast, working odd jobs and living in boarding houses, never staying in one place for too long. This transient lifestyle had served Hickey well in avoiding detection, but it also left a paper trail that investigators could follow. Employment records, boarding house registries, and witness testimonies began painting a picture of a man who moved frequently, often leaving jobs abruptly, and had been present in multiple locations where suspicious deaths or disappearances had occurred. The investigation revealed that Hickey's pattern was remarkably consistent. He would arrive in a new town, find temporary employment, blend into the community, and then either commit a crime and flee or leave when he sensed suspicion building. His ability to appear normal and even respectable had allowed him to operate for decades without serious scrutiny. As police delved deeper into Hickey's background, they uncovered his previous conviction for the murder of Edwin Morey in 1883, his time at the YMCA, his brief membership in the Masonic Lodge, and his subsequent years of drifting. The picture that emerged was of a man who had been perfecting his predatory skills for nearly 30 years. When Hickey was finally arrested, his demeanor was eerily calm. Witnesses described him as showing little emotion, even when confronted with evidence of his crimes. During questioning, he maintained the same detached, almost clinical tone that had characterized his postcards. He spoke of being driven by something I could not stop, but this sounded more like an excuse than genuine remorse. There was no dramatic breakdown, no emotional confession, no recognition of the devastation he had caused. Instead, Hickey treated his arrest and interrogation as if they were inconveniences rather than consequences of horrific crimes. When John Frank Hickey finally stood trial, the details of his crimes horrified everyone who heard them. The murder of 7-year-old Joey Joseph, combined with the taunting postcards, left little room for sympathy from the public or the jury. The prosecution presented a clear case. They had the handwriting evidence linking Hickey directly to the postcards. They had his confession obtained during questioning. They had testimony from witnesses who placed him in Lackawanna at the time of Joey's disappearance. Most damning of all, they had the postcards themselves, those twisted messages that revealed the mind of a true monster. Throughout the trial, Hickey maintained his eerily calm demeanor. Court observers noted that he listened quietly to testimony about his crimes, rarely reacting, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. Even when the most disturbing details of Joey's murder were presented, Hickey showed no visible emotion. The defense had little to work with. How do you defend someone who had confessed to murder and sent detailed descriptions of his crimes through the mail? Their only real strategy was to argue for Hickey's mental state, suggesting that no sane person would commit such acts or taunt police so brazenly. This approach had some effect. When the jury reached their verdict, they found Hickey guilty of murder in the second degree rather than first degree. 2 jurors believed he was insane and should not be executed. This decision meant that instead of facing the electric chair, Hickey would spend the rest of his life in prison. The verdict brought mixed reactions. Many people felt that someone who could murder a child and then mock the grieving family deserved the ultimate punishment. Others agreed that Hickey's behavior suggested severe mental illness that, while not excusing his crimes, made execution inappropriate. Hickey was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Auburn Prison in New York. Even in prison, he remained an enigma to guards and fellow inmates. He was described as quiet, intelligent, and surprisingly well-behaved. He read extensively, wrote letters, and seemed to adapt to prison life without major incident. But there were hints that his fundamental nature hadn't changed. Guards reported that Hickey showed no real remorse for his crimes. He would discuss them in clinical terms when asked, but never expressed genuine sorrow for his victims or their families. He seemed to view his imprisonment as an unfortunate consequence rather than just punishment. On May 8, 1922, John Frank Hickey died in Auburn prison at the age of 56. He had spent the last decade of his life behind bars, taking whatever other secrets he might have possessed to his grave. His death marked the end of one of America's first highly publicized serial killer cases, but it left many questions unanswered. How many other victims were there? Were his claims in the postcards about killing 12 children true, or were they the boasts of a man seeking infamy? What had really driven him to such extreme violence? The story of John Frank Hickey, the postcard killer, isn't just about murder. It's about control, manipulation, and a terrifying need to be seen. Long before profiling, databases, or national manhunts existed, Hickey exploited the system, taunting families and police through chilling postcards that turned private grief into public fear. He blended intellect with cruelty, normalcy with monstrosity, proving how easily evil can hide in plain sight. But what's most unsettling is this: how many clues were missed, how many warnings went unheard, and how close Hickey came to getting away with it forever. His postcards weren't just messages. They were confessions hiding in plain view. If you think this is where the story ends, it doesn't. There are deeper details, unanswered questions, and disturbing insights that change how this case is understood even today. To uncover the full story, explore every chilling detail, and dive deeper into the mind of the postcard killer, download the Skoob app now and get exclusive access to the complete episode. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.